Hi everyone, welcome to the MrpTech podcast. This is episode 156. My name is Matt, and this is the weekly podcast discussing everyday tech for everyday people. In this week's episode, what I want to talk to you about is a Linux distro that's specifically built for a certain set of people. And to tell you a little bit about it, what I want to do is briefly take a look at another podcast that I listen to. Now, Linux in the Ham Shack is a podcast I've listened to for years. It's a very informative podcast, both on Linux and on open source software. And I don't know exactly what episode looks like. They're on episode 288 now at this point in time when I'm recording this podcast. So they've been around for years. And if you go to lhspodcast.info and under their content section, all the way down to torrents, you can get a list of all of their episodes from episode 1 all the way up to their current episode available through a torrent. One of the things that they have been doing for the last year or so is they have been providing a spin or a respin of Ubuntu that is specifically meant for amateur radio operators. Now, myself, I am an amateur radio operator. I know there's a few in the Discord room as well that are also amateur radio operators. And there are a lot of people out there that are looking for software, especially if you're trying to get into digital modes, that type of thing, for amateur radio. Now, I have tried in the past a few different amateur radio Linux distributions, one of them being Skywave Linux. There was another one that I can't recall the name of right now. And then when I heard about this, I decided to give it a shot about a year ago. And I didn't do much with it at the time, but one of the things that I wanted to do recently is I wanted to take my old test laptop and basically take one of these spins of the LHS Ubuntu variant and see what it can do with the hobby that I'm interested in. So here's the thing about Linux is that there are literally thousands of distributions available, and some of them are meant for beginners, like Ubuntu or Linux Mint. Others are meant more for like commercial enterprises, like Red Hat Enterprise Linux, SUSE Enterprise Linux, all those types of things. And there are some that are more server-based, like CentOS. There are others available that are built specifically for a certain specific reason. So, like an example of Arch Linux is meant for bleeding edge software, whereas Debian Linux is built for stability, and sometimes with that stability you get older software, that type of thing. So there are lots of great variants out there of many different types of distros, and some of them can be quite specific in the software that they are using. So to give you an example, one example would be the video multimedia Linux distribution called Ubuntu Studio. They provide graphics design, they provide video editing software, audio editing software. They all available for someone who is in those fields, like a video editor or a graphics designer, and they weren't really aware of the software that was available under Linux. They could download Ubuntu Studio and use that. Now, another example of that would be Scientific Linux, that is now defunct, meant for more science experiments and that type of thing. So there are specific distros meant to take people who might not be familiar with Linux, that are looking for specific free and open source software, and get them up and running very quickly. So does this LHS Ubuntu sort of respin make that possible for amateur radio operators? I think that it does. And I think it's also great that these podcast hosts are giving back to the community. Now, to give you an example of what I did, now looking on their website currently, they have a couple of different versions available. They have a standard Ubuntu version using 1804.2. They have the Ubuntu Mate version with the Mate desktop. They also have a Xubuntu version. Now, when I started doing this several weeks ago, maybe even a month or two now, I've sort of lost track. There was also a Kubuntu version on here, and that is what I actually downloaded and put onto my test laptop. But I have also, in my Educational Technology Center here at school, we have also tried the Mate version because we had an HP all-in-one computer, really old computer, and it was running Skywave Linux. Now it is dual booting Skywave with this LHS Ubuntu Mate version, and so I have experience running both the Mate version and the KDE desktop. So what I wanted to do today was take a little walkthrough with some of this. If you're watching the enhanced video, I do have my secondary laptop here set up with my capture card. It took a little bit to get it going today. I'm not really sure what was happening with OBS, but so what I took a look at is I with my test laptop, I also dual booted Skywave Linux and this LHS Ubuntu. And for me, it's been a while since I have sort of ventured into KDE. So that was one of the reasons why I really wanted to try the KDE desktop version of this, more for fun for me, because I had been wanting to take a look at KDE again in the future. But no matter which version you download, all the software is still going to be there as far as amateur radio software is concerned. So I'm not going to talk today a whole lot about the KDE options that are available. What I want to talk to you about is the software that comes pre-installed for amateur radio operators. So it's all very easy to find, and I'll be honest that some of this software, I don't know what it does. Some of it's very useful for me, others not so much. So the first thing that you're going to see in this list of amateur radio software is Chirp. And Chirp is a radio programming software. You can program your handheld radio. You can program any other radio that has an interface for programming, basically. Makes it very easy if you're programming multiple radios, or if you have a list of 100 or 1,000 different channels that you want to program on your radio. If you're trying to program a lot of repeaters, or if you're trying to program a lot of local frequencies, or if you're going on a trip and you want to program the frequencies along the routes of your trip, that is your best friend rather than programming it manual in the radio. Because a lot of times programming radios manually, it's not that it's difficult, it's just that it's there's a lot of steps to it and it takes a while. Cubic SDR is a cool piece of software that it's basically like a waterfall. You can hook up an SDR dongle to your laptop, and you can scan the area for radio waves and radio frequencies being used. So you not only can you pick up FM, AM, that type of thing, but you can also pick up any radio communications in your area as well. There's a couple of different SDR software available here that are included, and I really like the fact that they did that. They didn't just pick one, and because there are many people out there with many different tastes, and I'm glad that they were able to do it. There is some studying software as well for taking the amateur radio test. I would say that this piece of software isn't really the best that's available right now for studying for the amateur radio exam, but it is an option for somebody who's just wants to take a look at it, help them out. The software that I would recommend is like Ham Radio Online. There are apps for Android and iOS that are really great. That gives you the actual question pools, just like this does, but in a much nicer way, let's say. This one really isn't all that graphically good looking. It's kind of looks kind of old, that type of thing. There's other programs like FL Digi for basically digital modes. But there's quite a long list of software here for anybody in the amateur radio field. What I really liked about this, as opposed to Skywave has always felt a little bit rough around the edges for me, and I'm not really sure why that is. I've never really had issues, but Skywave was quite dated now at this point. I believe it was built off of 1604, and that may have been updated at this point. I'm not exactly sure, but this is more up to date. This is the current Ubuntu LTS, so you get all the latest with that as well. It just seems to be a little bit more modern looking, a little bit more stable, not only in KDE, but also in Mate. Skywave Linux is also built off Mate, and just doesn't have the polish that this one particular does. What I don't believe that the guys from LHS Linux and the Ham Shack podcast have actually done anything to change Ubuntu. I think it's just a stock Ubuntu release with that desktop, and they add the software. So they're taking on already what has already been produced and just adding specific set of software. So it's not like they built their own Linux distribution at this point in time. They're just basically taking an Ubuntu spin, adding software that they need, and making it useful for someone who might not really be aware of what Linux is, how to manage it, that type of thing. So I think Ubuntu is a really great choice for something like this. Now, all the guys in my radio club, I know some of them are already using Linux, but if some of them were looking for something else for their Ham Shack, that type of thing, this would be something that I would recommend to them. Ubuntu is very easy to install. Usually it's just a matter of plugging in a USB drive and a couple of clicks and you're ready to go. I probably would recommend the Mate version to them because a lot of times, they may have older computers, and Mate just seems to run well on older computers. So here at the school, we have that all-in-one HP desktop that is quite old. It was a donated computer to the school, and we have it hooked up to one of our antennas on the roof, so we can show students how to hear sound waves. And programs like Cubic SDR pick up every type of radio frequency available. So one of the cool things that I like to do is I like to take my key fob out of my pocket, and I like to show my students that when you unlock and lock your car doors, that is all through radio signals. So I'll open up Cubic SDR and I will find the frequency for the particular make and model of my car and that type of stuff. Now, I don't have my SDR dongle plugged into my computer right now, but if I pick the right frequency during this waterfall, it would actually show the radio signal, and you would actually be able to see in a visual way when I push the key fob button for unlock and lock. It's usually around 315 megahertz, I believe, somewhere 315, 318, somewhere in that range, and you can actually show the students, and their eyes get super wide and super bright when you're taking a look at this, and they're like, really? And it shows them that there's more to this world than they think. And the next question that usually comes out is, does that mean that somebody could take this signal and copy it and unlock our car doors? And well, yes, that's technically possible. It is quite difficult. And this is just showing you the radio wave created by the radio signal created by pushing that button. So it's kind of fun to show the kids all different things. And if you get lucky, you can hear somebody using radios close by. And just another way to get students interested in amateur radio, in radio in general, because they all carry around radios every day with them. They just don't realize it. Cell phones are basically handheld radios. They're working on specific frequencies, just like amateur radio is, except they don't need a license to use it. So showing them sort of the grassroots, the original social network, so to speak, of amateur radio, it shows them that it's still usable today. It's still a thing. It's still something that you can be interested in. You can even go back and learn Morse code, that type of thing. So there's a lot here with LHS Ubuntu that I think if anybody was really interested and wanted to learn about amateur radio, you would be able to do that. Now, some of the software does need a call sign to be able to use, and it will ask you that as soon as you open it up. So just keep that in mind. But anybody can monitor radio frequencies. So you do not need a license to monitor and to listen to radio frequencies. There is other software included here that you can use for logging your contacts. There are so they've thought of really everything when it comes to LHS Ubuntu. Logging your contacts. There's software here for making sure your antenna is set up correctly. So there's one piece of software. It's kind of hard for me to read here on both screens. XNEC2C, which is antenna analysis. I tried this on my antenna and I did not get it to work, and that could be more user error than anything else. But it's a really long list of included software here. And if I were to recommend this over Skywave has other things that are kind of neat that are not amateur radio operating. For instance, it's got software where you can track planes that are flying in the air. Now, this can all be done online. All planes that are flying in the air can and do produce many radio signals and used for online tracking. If you've ever seen a map of all the planes flying in the country, it's pretty impressive. I remember just recently, my parents were returning from Florida, and I picked them up at the local airport. Now, when they're flying, their phones needed to be on airplane mode, and they told me approximately when they would arrive. So I got to the airport way earlier because I wanted to be a nerd and try this. But I actually was able to track their plane from basically several hundred miles away. I could have tracked it all the way from Florida, but I was tracking their plane from several hundred miles away and watching it fly north towards the airport I was picking them up at. And I knew exactly when the airplane would be arriving. It would say even up to the second, it would the wind speed sometimes would slow the airplane down, so it would adjust the time. And I watched the airplane basically fly overhead and circle around and then line up with the runway. And then sure enough, there it is. The airplane came and landed. It was actually quite fun to track an airplane for that long. And a lot of people don't think to do that when they're waiting for, to pick somebody up at an airport. You can actually track them in flight in time if you know how to, if you find their plane. And a lot of the planes have information from where they departed from, where they're going, the I don't want to say call sign, but the name designation of the plane, where series of numbers, that type of thing that the plane has for keeping in touch with various towers. So it's kind of fun to do that. with this type of software. You don't need Linux to do that. You can go online and just track it through various web browsers. So Skywave has some features that are kind of cool that are built in that LHS doesn't have. But again, that's not necessarily amateur radio stuff. It's still radio, but it's not amateur radio. So with that specific need for amateur radio operators, what I would do is probably recommend LHS over Skywave at this point. Skywave isn't just about amateur radio. It's about other things. It's about privacy. It's about giving freedoms to certain people in certain countries that don't necessarily have it. So there's that aspect with Skywave Linux. With LHS, it's meant for a specific group of people, a specific task, specific software. And I really like that. All the software that's included with in this case, Ubuntu or the Mate desktop, all the software that's included in those distributions are included by default, which is really great. So there's a lot happening here with LHS, and the idea of giving back to the community is always something that I enjoy. And if you've never listened to Linux in the Ham Shack, I suggest you subscribe to their podcast, because if you're a big fan of Linux, they talk a lot about Linux stuff. But there is a whole lot of similarities between Linux and amateur radio, and I can't stress that enough. If you are a fan of Linux, you should check out amateur radio stuff, because it's taking what you know about Linux and applying a lot of this stuff in the real world. So there's a lot of electronics involved. There is a lot of learning science and theory behind this that's involved, and it opens you up to a community of people that are all around the world that have all the same interests. And just like Linux, that community grows over time. A lot of people think that amateur radio is sort of going away at this point, but ever since I've started, more and more and more of it has evolved, even in just the short amount of time that I've been involved with it. A lot of things are going more digital modes now than it's in, say, in the past. And some people like that, some people don't, but it is constantly evolving. And there's things like Echolink and FT8 and all these other modes that are out there that will open you up to a wide range of communication across the world. IRLP we have set up here at the school connects repeaters all over the world, basically just with an internet connection. So you don't need to have an HF radio where you can talk all over the world. You can use the internet to help you there, and it's a kind of a neat thing. So check out Linux in the Ham Shack. It's a great podcast. I want to give them a plug, and also a thank you for what they have actually done. I'm not really sure what happened to the Ubuntu version. Looks like there still is a Ubuntu version available to download. If you go right to the main website, it says LHS Ubuntu builds. Download here, and it actually gives you it looks like they have several other versions as well that I was not aware of. They have Ubuntu Budgie. They have Ubuntu Studio versions. So yeah, they're providing multiple means for this software for basically people who have their own opinions on the desktops that they like to run. So that's going to do it for this week's podcast. I hope you enjoyed just talking a little bit about amateur radio. I know not everybody is interested in amateur radio, but I do like to talk about it from time to time because it is a valuable community resource, and most people don't understand the value of amateur radio. It is a community effort. It is a service. It is something that a lot of people hold in high respect, and you can get involved at your local county level, town level, and really provide something back that a lot of people don't necessarily know how to. And if it comes in times of emergencies, a lot of times you hear stories of amateur radio operators jumping into service before anyone else. If you all remember the issue that happened in Hawaii recently, within the last year and a half to 2 years, where all of a sudden there was a message popping up all over the place that there was an incoming missile and everybody should take cover. Well, it turned out that it was actually a test. Amateur radio operators knew in minutes that this was actually a test, and they spread the word as best they could over the radio, and a lot of people got that information. Obviously, there was some people that did not get that information, but within seconds, basically, the amateur radio operators were ready to go, and they actually helped out as best as they could. Another example of that is the mass shooting in Las Vegas, the really awful one that happened from the hotel room. Amateur radio operators got together. Right after that happened, they went to hospitals. They were able to coordinate which hospitals had available hotel rooms or hospital rooms for patients, and they were able to coordinate with emergency services on how to get those patients to the right hospital to get them the proper help that they needed. So I've done lots of shows on how to get an amateur radio license. It's important, and that's all I'm going to say about that. So kind of a neat thing. Next week, I think I'm going to take a look at KDE a little bit, and I'm going to tell you guys what my thoughts are on at least the LTS version of KDE at this point in time. So that's going to do it for this week. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.